Hi, this video is to show you some tips on four patches that are in the center of a square and a square unit. So I have two of the squared rulers in front of you, and I've got it on the end to square up the centers. This ruler here is one of the newer ones, and this one is an older one. The advantage of the new ruler is that these little hash marks right here in the center allow you to square up a four patch and do that using that squared ruler. This is a very strange size, and that's because in a square and a square unit, these are always placed on point. And so for a four patch to be centered, that on point measurement is very odd. So if you have a new ruler, that's awesome. It'll have this little center square for 4-inch finished blocks, and then there will be a little hash mark. And you follow that line around, and there's a hash mark and a hash mark. There's also a hash mark over here. So when you square that up, you would put this on there, and you're going to line up those little hash marks instead of any center point. Okay, so do you see that this hash mark, here's my center square for 4-inch finished measurement, and I've got that hash mark on the seam. I've got this hash mark on the seam. This one out here is on the seam, and this one right here is on the seam. And you would trim, and then you would turn the block around and line up the same way again. So I want you to look at this ruler while it's placed here, because if you do only have an old ruler, you can make it work. So let's just pay attention. Look right here. This dashed line that is the center square for the 2-inch finished, it's not the solid line, but it's that dashed line, lines up right here on the center. And this ruler also has the advantage of a diagonal line that's through here. So let me show you on an old ruler how to adjust that. So here's the old ruler. I'm going to draw my own diagonal line. So I have a white pencil here that is just a fabric marking pencil, but it says it would write on paper, glass, plastic, or metal. So it's good for marking up your templates, and you can get rid of those marks. So I'm going to line this up, and I'm going to draw a diagonal line. Okay, now I'm going to move my whiteboard so that you can see this better. And now can you see that white line that I've drawn on there? Okay, so then when I put my four patch underneath there, I can line up this diagonal line through the middle. And remember how those little dashed blocks, the dashed lines, sorry, lined up with this little outside unit? So I can line up that and square it off that way. And then I would turn the thing around. Now my littlest square is down in that corner. And I'm going to line up the center square for 4-inch finished blocks right there. And this is not as accurate. You can see that I'm a little bit off right here, but it is more accurate than trying to guess the halfway point for 3 5/8. Okay, so there's how you're going to do it if you have an older ruler. So of course the newer rulers are so much easier. So I'll show you this one. So here's my center square. I'm going to line up that hash mark, this hash, this one, and that one. Turn it around. Since I'm leaning over, it's kind of hard to get those angles sometimes. Okay, so do you see how that's possible to trim that nice and even by using this squared ruler? And I love how she updates her rulers when she discovers how to improve upon them. I love that about her rulers. So here's my last one. I'm going to line it up again. So there's the hash mark and the hash mark on the 4-inch finished. There's also going to be lining up there. Flip it around. Line up the 4 hash marks, as well as this little outside one. And so it's so much easier to make your 4 patches larger than needed, you know, so that you can then trim them to the correct size. All right, so now my next tip is when you're attaching the triangles. On a 4 patch, you can lay this over and you can line up the point of the triangle exactly right there in the middle, and then you'll have the exact same amount hanging out on both sides. When you take this to your sewing machine, I'm going to put this back underneath so that you can see that red. When you take this to your sewing machine to sew it, sew with the bias edge on the bottom next to your feed dogs so that this is the direction that you're sewing. You'll sew on 2 opposite sides, line up this point and sew it, line up this point and flip it over and sew that one, and then press them towards the triangles, and then sew on your last 2 sides, and you'll end up with this. Okay, now I want to show you how to trim up the square in a square. So I've got another color of mat board because I didn't realize that there was red doesn't show up on red very much. Okay, so I am ready to trim this. So since I trimmed this with the squared ruler and it's nice and centered, that makes this trimming even easier. Okay, so now I'm going to use the opposite end of my ruler, and I am going to put these X's, these 4 X's that say 4 for 4-inch finished. I'm going to put those 4 X's on the 4 corners of my block, my inside 4-patch block. Okay, so here's a 4, a 4, a 4, and a 4, and the X marks all 4 points. Then I will just hold this in place. I'll trim these 2 sides, and I'll flip it around and line up those 4s again, as well as this outside square, and you trim off the last 2 sides. Now we have a square and a square that has a perfect 1/4-inch seam allowance right here, so that when we sew, we won't be cutting off any of our inside 4 patch. And so that is your tip for 4 patches in the middle of a square and a square unit.